The best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. Be a better you in 2024 with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. Don't pay hundreds of dollars for private tutors or waste hours on apps that don't really help you speak the language. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel's designed by real people for real conversations. Babbel's tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. For instance, I've been using Babbel's convenient courses to help me learn basic conversational skills in German while I'm getting ready for a little trip I'm planning. It's not a language I'd ever studied before, but I find the lessons really easy and kind of like hand-holding me through learning a completely new language to me. And it's reassuring to know that with the help of Babbel, I'll be able to greet people, order food, and ask for directions without having to consult language apps while I'm in Deutschland. I'm still learning. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/vulgar. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/vulgar, spelled BABBEL.com/vulgar. Rules and restrictions may apply.
The land down under has never been easier to reach. United Airlines has more flights between the U.S. and Australia than any other U.S. airline, so you can fly nonstop to destinations like Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane. Explore dazzling cities, savor the very best of Aussie cuisine, and get up close and personal with the wildlife. Who doesn't want to hold a koala? Go to united.com/Australia to book your adventure.
And welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. I'm your host, Anne Foster, and I want to give a special greeting to there's some new listeners out there. So I want to greet you after the weird coincidence of I did the Empress Cece episodes with Lana Wood Johnson, which she and I've been meaning to do for like ever and ever, and it just kind of finally worked out coincidentally. The Empress, the German TV show, came on Netflix and became really popular. And now there's this new movie about Cece called Corsage coming out. So we're in the midst of a bit of a Cece-sance, I guess. And that's brought some people to this podcast. So welcome. This is our International season, which has been going on since March 2022. Considerably longer than I had thought it would go. But we've got into these multi-part episodes and I'm having a good time, and here we go. So, although I will say things are starting to wrap up, an end is in sight for this season. I have plans for next season. There's going to be a petite hiatus after we finish International, but I don't want you to worry. Like, we're doing this episode. Part 2 of this episode is going to be next week, potentially part 3. I don't know how long it's going to be. Then there's going to be 3 more people to talk about, some interviews coming up. Anyway, that's behind the scenes, what I'm up to. So, the International season, the whole purpose of it was that the show has got following in all kinds of countries all over the place. And I really wanted to learn more about the places where listeners are from and share their stories with other listeners and have people who are listening from all different countries, to have them get their stories shared. So for that reason, I have been accepting suggestions from people, and I will continue to. I'm not stopping. Like, please send me suggestions of people. I was looking at I have this really long Google sheet of all the potential people for future episodes, and it's lengthy. And because I am a librarian, I have sorted it by continent and country and year, and there's a lot of exciting stuff that I have to investigate during the hiatus. Anyway, please send me ideas for episodes you'd like to hear for sure. And today's episode is one that was suggested by a listener. So Andrea, who is in Ecuador, suggested a woman who I think she has described to me, and Andrea has been really, really, really helpful contextualizing all this stuff for me, because I didn't know anything about the history of Ecuador before I started learning about this, let alone the history of South America, as it turns out. A lot of this has been very humbling for me to learn how much I don't know when I start learning about things. But yeah, so Andrea describes our heroine this week and next, Manuela Sáenz, as an icon of the South American Revolution. She says, Manuela is one of the most iconic female characters of our country. She is so fearless, and even though most of the things shown today is her love story, there's so much more in how she helped through the revolution. So yeah, there is a love story in this, and it's the sort of thing, I've had this, I can't think of an example right now, but other people this season where like I had never heard of them before. And then when I go to kind of the most recent book about them, it's almost like defensive. They're like, she's more than just the love story. And I'm like, okay, I didn't know she was the love story. So she's more than just a love story. So we all know that. But kind of the reason why we know about her is because of the love story, because she was the longtime mistress of Simón Bolívar, the liberator of South America. So I'm going to be getting into the history of it. I really shouldn't say this off the top of my head, so I won't contextualize that at all because I'll probably get it incorrect. Oh, but I also wanted to mention, just while we're here in this little introduction era, so if any of you are listening on Apple Podcasts, I always say at the end, like, please rate and review and whatever, but I have a specific call to action for people who are listening on Apple Podcasts or who have the ability to put reviews on Apple Podcasts, because I recently got a review from someone who said that they think I say the word like too often. So if you're listening and you like this podcast, presumably you think I say the word like an appropriate amount of times. So just to counterbalance that, if that's how you feel free to leave a little review on Apple Podcasts saying that Anne says the word like an appropriate amount of times. And I guess that's another thing for anyone who's just new to this podcast. I was about to say, who's like new to the podcast. I'm not going to be self-conscious. Fuck that. Whatever. Anyway, the whole point of this podcast is I just talk like I talk in normal life. That's what we're about here. That's why it's a feminist women's history comedy podcast. It's not just like a history podcast where I just like say facts and stuff. My personality is like 50% of this podcast. So if you don't vibe with that, that's fine. But if you do, you should leave a thing on Apple Podcasts saying that I say the word like a normal amount of times. So Manuela Sáenz is who we're talking about today. The main sources I had for her, and it's interesting. Okay, so the main source is this book called For Glory and Bolívar, The Remarkable Life of Manuela Sáenz by Pamela S. Murray. And Pamela S. Murray, thank God for this book. She went to all kinds of archives. There's lots of letters. Like, she really painstakingly went through to figure out, like, what are the facts? What do we know Manuela actually did or thought or wrote? There's a lot of legends and rumors about her. So I did also look at Wikipedia. I looked at some other websites, but as I was going through, I looked at the websites first to like orient myself, but ultimately a lot of what I read there, like Pamela S. Murray found, was like probably not true and like maybe a legend. So I'm going to just shout out those as the main sources, as well as the Oxford Encyclopedia of Women's History, which also, anyway, Pamela S. Murray, thank God for this book. So again, it's a funny thing of like, I'm going to have to like tell you like people say this, but actually it was this. And many of you might be like, I didn't know people said that. So we're looking at South America. The last time that this podcast visited South America was when I believe Catalina de Arauso was stabbing her way around there in a fairly chaotic way. Llamas were involved. We are going to intersect some of the cities I mentioned here. I was like, I know that city name, and it's because it was a place that Catalina de Arauso went back in the day. So, yeah, it's been a minute since I compared years of like, when does a story take place? When does other stories take place? In general, this podcast, I go in chronological order because that is just what I decided to do. These last several episodes, we're just kind of bouncing around the 19th century back and forth based on when I have time to research who. So let's just like ground this in where and when we are, because the time period, well, I guess the time period is important to anyone's life, but this is like a really chaotic moment that this story kicks off with. So Manuela Sáenz was born in 1797. That is the same year Mary Shelley was born, 30 years after Caroline of Brunswick was born, 20 years before Lola Montez. And so it's kind of like, so about 200 years after Catalina de Arauso was stabbing her way around some of these cities. Why do I keep bringing up Catalina de Arauso? Because she was in South America during the time that Spain was conquesting that entire continent. Portugal was also. So 200 years. So Spain has been in South America for about 200 years by the time Manuela Sáenz is around. So it's an equivalent-ish period of time to like Britain was in the United States for whatever amount of time before like the American Revolution happened. So it's like, it's been long enough that the colonies of Spain have been kind of like, you know, there's been a couple generations of people have been born there. Like people have been born in South America to Spanish parents. Like, so they're just that kind of separate from Spain itself in the same way that the United States was separate from Britain or England itself when they did the American Revolution. Yeah, so I just also think it's interesting. Like she's born in 1797. So this all happens, this story is like this episode, which is the first part of her story. It's like the 1820s, which is what I often think of as like the Regency era, you know, so like Mary Shelley, Jane Austen, Bridgerton, Empire Waistgowns, like that's what's happening in England. But this is what was happening in South America. So Manuela was born in, as I said, 1797. So she was born in Quito, which is, hang on. So there is a whole lot of information I'm not going to get into because I do not fully, I've done the deep dive on Manuela herself, not about like the political situation. I just tried to learn about as much as I needed to understand what she was up to. But effectively, so we're looking at kind of the top west part of South America, which when she was born was mainly known as the Viceroyalty of New Granada. So also called the Viceroyalty of the New Kingdom of Granada or the Viceroyalty of Santa Fe. This is an area that corresponds to modern Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, and Venezuela. And it was under the jurisdiction of the Spanish Empire. And by the time Manuela was born, there's already been some movements from both where she is from, so Quito itself, which is now the capital and most populous city of Ecuador at that time. It was part of, what was it called? It's like the Audiencia of Quito. So it was like part of the Viceroyalty, but not really. And this is where I'm just like, it's like the amount of change that is happening and gonna happen in the story. I was trying to think like what I could compare it to just so you could understand the like slippery nature of like land borders and like what are the countries called and are they countries or are they viceroyalties? It's kind of, honestly, I don't know. Ugh. I'm going to say just in terms of like level of chaos and uncertainty, it's like if I was telling a story where somebody was born right in the middle of like England's War of the Roses, where it's like Plantagenets and Yorks and like Tudors and just like, you know, it's going to settle down eventually, like just settle, but it's just chaos at the moment. So there's like a whole bunch of places in this part of South America, all under the jurisdiction of the Spanish Empire, but basically all of which have have been working towards, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, like getting independence from Spain and being their own thing. So her full name, and she gets the title Doña because her father is noble. So Doña Manuela Sáenz de Vergara y Aizpuru was the illegitimate child of Simón Sáenz de Vergara, who was a well-born Spanish adventurer, so from Spain. He was a married man with 4 children. His wife was not her mother. Her mother was a 30-year-old or in her 30s-year-old neighbor, unmarried woman, family friend named Maria Joaquina Aizpuru. So Maria Joaquina was from a wealthy and aristocratic family as well, but it's a whole situation of like, well, he's married. So like these two they could never get married, so she was illegitimate. And so when Manuela was born, I think it was this sort of thing where like Maria Joaquina was sort of like hidden away. The baby was born, but just kind of no one really admitted like that she was the mother of the baby, which becomes important to Manuela later for like inheritance reasons. Maria Joaquina died shortly after she was born, seemingly. So potentially complications of childbirth. I'm going to propose that whole thing that we've talked about before in this podcast where doctors didn't know about washing their hands when they delivered babies. They would like touch, a dead body or a sick person, and then they would like go directly into like pull a baby out of a woman's vagina, and then that woman would get some sort of blood infection and then die, like happened to Henry VIII's wife, Jane Seymour. Anyway, so Maria Joaquina died shortly after Manuela was born. Her father admitted that he was the father right away. He never pretended like, whose baby is that? And so, in fact, he paid the 1,000 peso dowry required to get her accepted into La Concepcion convent, which I did not know that you had to pay a dowry. Like, usually I've only heard about dowries in terms of getting people to marry daughters. Anyway, so he paid the dowry so that she could go to this convent, and where she was raised by nuns. So this particular convent, La Concepcion, was the oldest, largest, and richest of 6 female monasteries in Quito. This convent only admitted the daughters of the most noble families, and so the facility was very affluent. Like, I presume that means like good meals, nice beds, like everything was nice. And they were not a super strict convent in like a scale of like really strict convent to like party convent. One thing I read described it as a party convent, but I think it's more just like their thing was not like this particular order of nuns. Their thing was not like being strict and mean all the time. It was kind of like good works and stuff like that. So like it was, in terms of convents, like seemingly the best one for her to grow up in. So she grew up here. She's very well educated. So she learned literacy as well as domestic arts, which included, interestingly, candy making. As an adult, she kept in touch with these nuns and went to them for advice. So clearly she had a strong connection to them, but which makes sense because like they raised her from infancy. Although she did also, like she knew who her father was, and he sort of integrated her into his household a bit. Like he knew her half siblings. And so what was it like growing up in colonial frontier South America in the early 1800s? So women were actually allowed considerable freedom relative to the times, and I guess to what freedom women would be allowed in like Spain, for instance. So Manuela grew up knowing how to smoke, drink, and swear. There is a rumor / legend that when she was around 17, she may have run away or tried to run away with a military guy who was her lover. We don't know if she actually did that, but the rumored lover is Fausto de El Huyar, the son of Fausto El Huyar and the nephew of Juan Jose El Huyar, who were, fun fact, the co-discoverers of tungsten. Anyway, so we don't know if she tried to run away. Although, like, can I just say, like, I forget when I have the part in my notes about, like, what was her personality like, but she was, like, she had some real chaotic energy, which she found ways to funnel in helpful directions. But she was a prankster. She loved nothing more than a good joke. She loved scandalizing people. So, like, growing up in, like, a borderline party convent, like, maybe she did try to run away. But we do know that at around the same time, her father decided to marry her off. So that could have been a way to be like, she's a little out of control. Let's try to like make her a wife, and that'll make her be more quiet. And so he chose as her husband a man who, so his dad was this like businessman, this like very rich businessman. Oh, I want to say also, so the culture of like New Granada was, again, I'm going to compare it to like the United States. So it's like people, like the colonists came over from Spain. These were like white people, like in the sense of like skin color was very important. So they were like pale skinned white people that came over from Spain. And that became like the aristocracy of Quito and of New Granada. And there was also like, there's obviously the indigenous people there. I believe it was the Incas were in this region. And then also the Spanish came over. They brought enslaved Black people with them. So there's like people here of various complexions. But the most important people had pale skin and prided themselves on their pale skin. And so, yeah, so it's very much just like you wanted to be kind of as white as possible. So even though, I don't know, I guess it's complicated because the whole like wanting to separate from Spain of it all, but like you wanted to be like as most like your lineage was European. The way the people in the US would be like, oh, my ancestors can date all the way back to the Mayflower. Like that's how white I am. So Manuela was light-skinned with dark hair. I guess she was described as having a roses and cream complexion. She was very beautiful, pale skin, dark hair, kind of a Lola Montez-esque appearance. But in her case, it's because she's actually of Spanish descent. I picture her kind of like an Ana de Armas looking person. But yeah, so she was beautiful, which is important because it affected how people reacted to her and also what she was able to get away with, because also she was very wealthy and she had the privilege of having this roses and cream light skin complexion. And the fiance that her father chose for her was English, like from England, which was seen as a prestigious match because he was a white person. His name was James Thorne, and there were like some wealthy English people were there, like running plantations, like sugar plantations, I think is what he was doing. James Thorne was about twice her age. Like she's about 20 and he's about 40. But also because he was from England, I think it was probably a good match for her because maybe he wouldn't like some of the wealthy white Spanish people or like people of Spanish descent who were there. Confusingly to me, the word that's used for the like really aristocratic white people whose ancestors came over from Spain, but who themselves were born in South America is Creole, which is a word that until now I had thought only meant like mixed race, like Black people from like Louisiana. But the Creoles in this context were like people whose ancestors had come over from Spain, and then they only ever had children with people who were also descended from Spain. Anyway, so the Creole culture, maybe it would have been harder to find like a good husband for Manuela because she was illegitimate. But James Thorne, who is from England, was rich and maybe didn't have some of the same hangups. And so he married her. And so she left Quito to go to Lima to marry him. And so Peru, Tito Brigade, Peru can let me know. Because Peru was at times in this story an independent, I think, republic. But then at times is part of New Granada. So I'm not sure. But anyway, Lima, Peru, a place where perhaps the ghost of Catalina de Arauso and her 500 llamas were still there in some way. That is where Manuela went to marry James Thorne. They had a lavish wedding celebration that lasted for 3 days. And here's the thing. So yes, like she's 20. She just married a 40-year-old man. She is like, we're going to get into it, but just like a prankster, a goofball, real weirdo. So her options for what she was going to do was either like she'd be married off or she would become a nun. And I think of the two options, this suits her personality better because being married opened up her world in the sense of she now had more independence as a married woman. So not unlike what we talked about a few weeks ago with the Joseon Kingdom of like oldie times Korea, Spanish society and the society of this New Granada was very much modeled after Spain, society in Spain. So there wasn't many rights for women. For instance, women were treated as legally minors and thus like children, ineligible for full participation in civil society or for inclusion in civic or public life. Women were barred from all positions of leadership and governance, including, with the exception of widows, from being head of households. Marriage placed wives under their husband's authority and required them to seek consent before doing a lot of stuff. But unlike women in this exact era in France, Britain, or the US, women in South America, and I guess in Spain, maintained their own judicial identity. So as soon as she was married, she was recognized under the law as a separate and distinct person rather than just as someone subsumed into the being of her husband. She also would retain a certain independence and freedom of action. She could draft her own will, testify in court, and accept inheritance without her husband's consent, which becomes important later. There's like a whole inheritance saga. So basically, to an upper-class woman like Manuela, this was like a relatively decent bargain. Like, marry some boring guy and you get kind of more independence and more rights. She also became the mistress of a wealthy household. And then she also, like, he trusted her. Like, James Thorne is not going to win the, like, award for being an okay husband, but he could have been much worse. You know what? He could have been so much worse. I'm going to say he's not going to win the, like, supporting award because he did not support a lot of what she did, but he was not awful. He was an okay husband, and he saw that she was smart and capable, and so she became his confidant and business collaborator. And like, when he went out of town, she would like run the business or like run the household. Like, she knew what's what. She like could do stuff. But she knew that like financially she was entirely dependent on him, and she saw another option. So she sought to claim inheritance from her mother's family. So like, everyone always knew who her father was. Like, she had his last name. Like, she visited his house. Like, he arranged her marriage. But the identity of her mother had been kept secret for, I guess, scandal reasons. But it's like, how secret was it? Like, maybe an open secret? So she hired a lawyer to officially petition for her to get some inheritance from the Aizpuru family. And so because of the way that laws work, if she got this inheritance, this would be her money, and James Thorne couldn't control it. So it'd bring her a measure of independence. So even though she hasn't like found her calling in life, like, she's trying to find ways to like have a bit more independence for herself. But meanwhile, Manuela was in Lima, which was a much bigger city than Quito. So at this time, there's something like 65,000 people living there, which was more than 3 times the number in Quito, where she was from. So it's just like, moving from the small town to the big city. Plus, in Lima, women had, like, on top of what I just talked about being like, here's how Spanish law worked. Women in Lima were known for having an unusual degree of freedom and mobility, like specifically women in Lima. So unlike women in Spain and even elsewhere in Spanish America, women in Lima were allowed to walk around unchaperoned, which led to the women mingling with people of all classes. So like upper class, lower class, people of all different skin complexions. And this was like just not what was done. I feel like this was not done in what my notes here just say, like, not like Spain, not like Spanish America. I feel like not like England, not like France, not Italy, like not Sweden. So when European men came to Lima to visit, they were shocked. I just need to give a shout out to one of my favorite podcasts, which is the SVH podcast, the Sweet Valley High podcast. It's hosted by 2 hilarious women from Ireland. And it's truly the way that I think Vulgar History may have been for some of you. Like, it's a show that I just like binged the entire back catalog during quarantine, and they're fabulous. And so there's basically their podcast is they just go, every episode of their podcast is a different book in the Sweet Valley High book series. They're up to book like 95 or something. By now they have a massive back catalog. Anyway, there's one episode, it's a super special, where the Sweet Valley High twins, Elizabeth and Jessica Wakefield, go to this small town, I forget, in like Iowa, to visit their elderly aunt and uncle. And when one of them, probably Jessica, does something that the aunt finds shocking, the aunt is like, "Herman, my pills!" And then it's become sort of a long-standing joke on this podcast that whenever something happens, it's just like, "Herman, my pills!" Just sort of this pearl-clutching feeling. So I feel like these European men went to Lima, saw women like Manuela just like chilling out, talking, probably smoking, with people of different classes and different races. And the European men are just like, "Herman, my pills!" Just so you know, that's how they were. Anyway, so why were things different there? And I'm not sure why things are different there, but part of what helped things be different, why women were able to do this, is because of the city's traditional female costume, the saya y manto. And I'm going to put pictures of this on the Instagram page just so you can see what it looks like. It's quite a look. So this ensemble was a long pleated skirt with decorative fringe and a manto, I guess that's the saya. The manto is a black shawl that's sort of wrapped around your shoulders and then wrapped around your head and then kind of half wrapped across your face. So it's very oldie time lady superhero mixed with like a hijab sort of vibes, where like all that you see is just like a woman dressed in this outfit and all you see is the eyes. So you're sort of disguised. So like no one knew who is who because all the women were all dressed like this, I guess. And that allowed them more freedom, I guess. Where did this outfit come from? You tell me. I don't know. But I think it's fabulous. So yeah, so Manuela went from like, it's such a, if you picture her being like whatever she is, like 19, 20 years old, and she goes from the small town, like being in this like nunnery, but also being sort of literally like protected, to being suddenly having independence available to her and then being in the big city. And so it's just like, you know, someone goes to university or someone like moves to New York City or something. And she had, like so many young people this age, a political awakening. And so again, like this is not the podcast to like learn the specifics of the political situation of 1820s South America. But just please know there was chaos happening all over the place. Part of the reason why was there had been the American Revolution recently-ish, the French Revolution, like people were just kind of like, wait, revolutions can work? That's great. Also, recently-ish, Napoleon had invaded Spain and booted out the monarchy, which kind of like put the Spanish colonies into like, wait, who's in charge of us? Even though the king came back later. Just war battles all over the place. And women in Lima and throughout South America were participating in this political conflict. So in Lima specifically, the political conflict was centered on, well, I guess if we break down to its like most basic level, there's like people who are still loyal to Spain versus people who wanted autonomy from Spain. So it's the loyalists versus the patriots. Manuela was on the side of the patriots. So upper class women like Manuela, and literally like her, like she is one of the people who did this, used her big house to host gatherings that served as forums for anti-Spanish criticism. Women like Manuela served as spies and couriers, as well as nurses, arms smugglers, and provisioners of food and clothing. I wonder if they could smuggle like the weapons in their like outfit, their like big skirt and the veil thing. I don't know. Sometimes in disguise, women would join in the battles dressed as men. They also were, quote, recruiters to the cause. Like they convinced people to join the patriot cause who maybe were loyalists before by using seduction. And then kind of like when, you know how in, I guess it was World War II, like the men went off to war and then the women stayed at home, but it's like, who's going to like run the car factories or whatever? And so women like did all these jobs and then the men came back and the women were like, actually, we like doing work and having jobs. So because women were needed and were welcomed into this patriot revolution, this made the women be like, wait a minute, I like independence. I like being able to do stuff. Like, what if there is a role beyond wife, mother, and or daughter? During this era, one of Manuela's friends who she made was the similarly intelligent, attractive, and flirtatious Rosita Campuzano, who is also passionate about La Revolucion. I don't know a lot about Rosita, but basically they're both co-hosting salons in support of revolutionary action, organizing women into groups to raise money for shipbuilding and uniforms. Rosita became the lover of General José de San Martin, the military figure known as the Protector of Peru. So, yeah, some of the like specific things Manuela did. So she participated in clothing drives to amass fabric and clothing to resupply the Patriot Army. And in fact, she was so involved, not just in like running a clothing drive or like having bake sales, but all the other stuff I said, you know, arms smuggling and like being a spy and things. So her devotion to the cause was noticed and appreciated. So she got public honor and recognition, including an official award, the Order of the Sun. So this entitled her to wear a white and red silk sash with a gold medal bearing the government's coat of arms and the phrase, "To the patriotism of the most delicate." So there's like the Order of the Sun brackets male, which men like who are really, I don't know, notable patriots would get. And that came along with like jobs and pensions. Women got like a sash, but it was still very prestigious. So how did her husband, James Thorne, and her family from Spain feel about this? So what we know is that her father and most of his family eventually returned to Spain, so they were not fans of La Revolucion. James Thorne, I do not believe, was all about this patriotic life, but he like really liked his young wife, and frankly couldn't stop her. So I don't know if he tried to stop her at this point. So this is kind of what she's doing. She's like a young woman who's like, and I know there's like some young people listening to this podcast. So I know this because sometimes you tag me on TikTok. There's like some teens, there's some youth who are like in the Tits Up Brigade brackets, junior varsity level. And I love this sort of arc for her. I think it might be similar to what maybe some of you are like in the midst of, where you go from being kind of like a young person who is just kind of like learning about the world, and then you kind of learn about politics and activism. And then like you see this so much with like Gen Z these days. Like, so her eyes were opened about these struggles that were happening. She saw, the struggle between like the patriots and the loyalists. And she's just like, I'm on team patriots, hardcore. Like, let's get this done. She's like, there's these opportunities for women to do stuff. And she's just like, hell yeah, let's do it. So she's like getting her groove. Like she's just figuring out that she wants to be this kind of like revolutionary, like activist person pursuing her dreams. She's also a real weirdo, which like she loves pranks, she loves jokes. She like a quote I read just recently, obviously the passing of Angela Lansbury was a cultural reset for many people. If there was a queue in London, like I would stand in line for 72 hours to pay respects to Angela Lansbury, my ultimate life role model. But I read a thing about her where somebody said one of the many things that's great about Angela Lansbury was that she took her work seriously, but she didn't take herself seriously. And that's what I feel about Manuela, because she's got, and I don't know, like we're going to talk about her sort of like legacy and stuff in part 2 next week. But some people just focus on, she was like this heroine of the revolution, which she was. Or some people focus on like, she was the mistress of Simón Bolívar, which like we're about to get to that. But she was also just like a real goofball. Like she had a fake mustache that she would wear to parties, and just she'd sometimes like dress up like a man in pants to be like, haha, I'm a man, and everyone's like, you're hilarious. Like she just sounds like a real laugh. And you can be all these things. You can be like a chaotic prankster and like a really committed revolutionary and like a super sexy woman. Like you don't have to choose. That's my message to the youth. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors. Did you know that President John Quincy Adams had a pet alligator that he kept in the East Room of the White House? Well, he didn't. That's a myth. What's not a myth is the story of Thomas Jefferson's four-horned ram that terrorized the White House lawn, an animal he knew was dangerous but did nothing to stop until it was too late and someone was dead. These are the kinds of stories that Howard Dory and Jessica Dory explore on the award-nominated podcast Plodding Through the Presidents. They combine compelling narrative dives with irreverent humor and marital banter, creating a show that listeners say is well-researched, insightful, delightful, and hilarious. They cover the myths, scandals, and rivalries that bring to life the personalities of the early United States. And they go beyond just the presidents, digging into folks like Benjamin Rush and Gouverneur Morris, two fascinating founders, neither of whom should be trusted with sharp objects. Catch up on their first 3 bingeable seasons now and plod along with Howard and Jess for the 4th season of Plodding Through the Presidents.
As a podcast network, our first priority has always been audio and the stories we're able to share with you. But at Realm, we also sell some pretty cool merch, and organizing that was made both possible and easy with Shopify. When you think about successful businesses like Aloe or Allbirds or Skims, an often overlooked secret is the business behind the business that makes selling and, for shoppers, buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. That's because nobody does selling better than Shopify. It's the home of the #1 checkout on the planet. And the not-so-secret secret that's definitely worth talking about is that Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%. That's more happy customers and way more sales going. If you're hoping to grow your business, your commerce platform better be ready to sell wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling, on the web, in your store, in their feed, and everywhere in between. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/realm, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/realm to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/realm.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who's ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. Anyway, so she's just like all in the revolution. And then she and her husband, so 1822, they went for a trip back to Quito, which was partially because her husband had business dealings to do there. Potentially he was like, what if we just like remove you from this like revolution business? But also she personally had this ongoing quest to try to get inheritance from her mother's family who were back in Quito. So I think for her, that was a lot of what she planned to do there. So the thing with the inheritance is that her mother's family had like all died. There's only one person left, which was her aunt Ignacia, who was the sole executor of the Aizpuru estate. And Manuela was like, can I get some inheritance? Like, I am the daughter of your sister, Maria Joaquina. But Ignacia refused to accept the claim, potentially to cover up, like, no, my sister didn't have a child out of wedlock. So I don't know if it was like that reason. So anyway, she was in town to like talk to Ignacia about this stuff, but guess who else was in Quito at this same time? Just a guy named Simón Bolívar. Now, this is a name I had heard before. Could not have told you who he was or what era he lived in, but now I know an awful lot about him, and you're about to learn too. So, Simón Bolívar was born in Caracas, which is in modern-day Venezuela, and I think oldie times Venezuela as well, or maybe it's part of the New Granada. Anyway, that's where he was born. 1783. So he's like 15 years older than Manuela. So he was the son of a noble Spanish Creole family. So he's 39 years old when he rolled into Quito at the same time Manuela was there. So Simón was orphaned very young, but he was very rich and also light complexioned. So he did just fine. He was raised by his wealthy family. And he was educated incredibly well, which included being sent to Europe. So he was sophisticated and cosmopolitan, perhaps more so than a lot of other people in this area who maybe hadn't been to Europe or hadn't had the opportunity to read as much like philosophy or whatever. And so by the time he got to Quito, like again for this like monumental meeting of him and Manuela, so he was known as the Liberator, a title he earned about a decade prior for his prominent role in Venezuela's anti-Spanish insurgency and for his leadership of Spanish America's largest, most dynamic patriot movement. So he's like George Washington, if that's who led the American Revolution, I don't actually know, / Napoleon kind of figure. He's just like the guy who like led this kind of like, let's do our own thing army. So this army, under his leadership, allowed him to begin realizing his political vision and to create a Colombian republic. So this republic is like, then it was called the Republic of Colombia, but like today, the country of Colombia is the Republic of Colombia. So to not confuse things, when we're talking about the oldie time one, we call it Gran Colombia. And so his goal was for Gran Colombia to kind of replace the viceroyalty of New Granada, which was like a Spain thing, and to make this be like its own independent thing. He dreamed of Spanish-American unity. So the capital of Gran Colombia was Bogota, and it was basically the same place that was the viceroyalty of New Granada. Modern-day Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama were kind of what Gran Colombia comprised. So Bolivar was elected the first president of Gran Colombia, and he was on his way to becoming the most powerful and prestigious man in Spanish America. He also had tuberculosis. So we'll talk about that later, but so he's doing all this stuff, but he would also just every now and then, I imagine, delicately cough into a handkerchief. It's like, oh no, there's blood, like Satine in Moulin Rouge. So yeah, kind of like Napoleon had been recently to them. And that was his hero, I think. Bolivar was a military hero and a revolutionary champion, destroyer of an old caste system and builder of new independent republics. He was also a conqueror. Like, he was not in Quito for fun, but he was there because he had just conquered it to make it part of Gran Colombia. So this was like a huge affair. So Bolivar was paraded into town. The residents of Quito were like, we're going to celebrate this because we don't want to get in trouble, but also maybe they're happy about it. I don't know. So the residents of Quito decorated their homes with flowers and red, blue, and gold flags, advertising their new identity as Colombian citizens. They cheered and watched him arrive in like this grand military parade. So there's 300 military officers came to the town square, and then another 700 horsemen joined the festivities. He was given like a garland crown. There was a special Thanksgiving mass, like, thank you for like making us be not part of Spain anymore. And then that night, there was a private ball at the home of a prominent family. And allegedly, this is where Bolivar met Manuela. So we don't know that for sure, because if we're just going by only things that are in letters, no one wrote a letter like, oh my God, when we met at that party that night. But like, probably Manuela would have been there. So one of her brothers, like her half-brother, was on the patriot side, and he was unmarried, so he would have had a +1 for this ball. So potentially he brought her as his date. Anyway, so the two of them met and they hit it off right away because she was lively and energetic and weird and beautiful, and he liked beautiful women who were smart. So they both, but like intellectually, like she had been given a good education at that convent, the party convent. He had been like obviously educated super well as well. So they were all like, oh my God, you like Voltaire's philosophy? Me too. So they both admire the same heroes, thinkers, and writers. Both were veterans in the fight against Spain. Both also had reputations as very sexy people, as well as revolutionaries. Like Simón was like, he had a wife and then the wife died. And then he just kind of was like, love him and leave him. Like he would just like take lovers wherever he went. So he's like kind of a ladies' man. But then also her like sexy, weird energy brought him new energy because he had like long tuberculosis or whatever you call it, whenever you have tuberculosis for a long time. Yeah, so she was hilarious and weird, and he vibed with her chaotic energy. He found her like, you are not like anyone I've ever met. And she's like, hell yeah, I'm not. So yeah, so like lots of people had affairs, especially in the like Criollo, like rich white people class. Just like everyone had affairs everywhere in the rich everything people class in like every country forever and still do. But the thing is, you like don't talk about it. You just like, you have affairs and it's like an open secret, like how the identity of her mother was an open secret, but you just like don't let anyone know about it. So like she was, of course, married, which was like, scandalous in another way, I guess. So they like became lovers, but it wasn't like, he wasn't open about it. She wasn't like, hey, I'm Bolivar and this is my lover, Manuela. Like they had to kind of keep it under wraps because she was like married and I don't know. It's just that whole stupid thing where it's like people are having affairs. We have to pretend like you're not, whatever. Anyway, here's some examples of Manuela being hilarious. So in one of her letters, she said herself, like, she loves nothing better than a good joke. She never took herself too seriously, and she loved pranks. She loved pulling pranks. Here's one of her hilarious pranks. So she had a friend or like a group of friends, like lady friends, who she would meet to go horseback riding. And one morning, like when they had arranged to meet to go horseback riding, she arrived disguised as a man, wearing her fake mustache and an officer's uniform. Before anyone could recognize who it was, she was like, ha ha ha, and then like ran off on her horse. So just like random, silly good times, hand swearing, disguised mustache. This is what's going on. Would it surprise you to know that some historians of the 20th century were like, hand swearing, fake mustache? She must have been some sort of like intersex person or like some sort of insane lesbian, where it's like, or she was just like a hilarious person who wore pants sometimes. Anyway, Bolivar wrote, like, obviously she was beautiful, but he said he loved her for her delightful temperament and her enchanting spirit, even more than her, like, hotness. He referred to her as his dear madwoman, like, because she was just, like, she had a personality and she's going to let it shine. And as soon as she met Bolivar, she's just like, this is it. Like, I'm your lover, like, so long, James Thorne. This is the end. James Thorne was like, but what about not leaving me? And she was like, no. In one letter, because a lot of what we know about her is like from her letters. So I'm going to read you, like, he wrote her a letter being like, please come be my wife again. I'm really boring. And she wrote, quote, no, 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 no. For God's sake, man, 1,000 times no, I will not go back to you. So, yeah, that's what she thinks. However, as much as she was devoted to Bolivar, he was like busy traveling around, conquering, being the president of Gran Colombia. And so she's just like, ugh, I don't love this, like being stuck in Quito. I think that's where she was staying, for business reasons, for her husband's business. So she's just like, I don't love being here for like 6 months, 9 months, and like not seeing my lover. So she figured out a way that she could travel with him, which was that she joined his entourage by getting herself a job as his personal archivist. So there's, an archivist is not the same thing as a librarian, but as I am personally a librarian, I respect that she took this career path. So this was obviously, but I'll just point out, a very unusual thing for a woman to do, as few women at the time occupied positions on the staff of armies. But crucially, her job meant that she got a paycheck and her own independent income, so she was more free to like leave James Thorne, but also be with her lover all the time. Side note, she's also an excellent equestrian, and we've had several of those lately. Cece also being an excellent equestrian who we looked at. And her outfit that she liked to wear was red pants and a black velvet poncho. Her loose curly hair falling out from under a plumed hat. She also, I think during her time with the army, she learned to become skilled with a sword and pistol, but remember she already knew how to drink, swear, and smoke. She was often described as eccentric. People were like, is she a lesbian because she wears pants? Even though she was also like the lover of a man. Anyway, here's a quote. She would dress up during the day as an official, and during the night she went through a metamorphosis with the help of some wine. So Manuela was following him, but always at a distance because, like, people, you didn't want to spread where he was going because Bolivar had lots of enemies. So because although they had like independence from Spain now, there's a lot of like civil infighting because he was like, I'm the president now of all these places that used to be their own thing. And all those places were like, what if you're not our president and we are our own thing again? So everyone didn't love what Bolivar was doing. It's kind of like they had all united against Spain, but once there wasn't a common enemy, they were like, no, we'll fight each other, I guess. So anyway, yeah, so she moved at a distance so that she wasn't with him. partially because she had to protect the precious archive. So she was just like a bookmobile person, just like traveling around with all these letters. She was his chief confidant, secretary, and advisor. Remember, he has tuberculosis, so she would read to him when he was tired and cared for him when he was sick. Simone's aide-de-camp, Daniel Florencio O'Leary, Irish name, just suggested that she be made a colonel, and people began to refer to her as Bolivar's woman. There was a big, momentous battle, December 9th, 1824, the Battle of Ayacucho, Peru, in which Bolivar's army won, and Spain lost. That was the last stand for Spain to try to be in charge of anything in South America. So there is a strong legend that Manuela was at this battle, and that to prove that she'd been at the battle, she cut off the mustache of a man who had died and then wore that mustache around as a joke. This has not been proven, but what a story. And also hilarious. We know she had a fake mustache. Maybe she one time made a joke like, oh yeah, I got this mustache off a man I killed in battle. And someone was like, she killed a man in battle and scalped his mustache. Anyway, from what Pamela Murray found in her book, where she's looking at actual records, not just legends and whatever, rumors, we don't know that Manuela or Simone were at this actual battle, but I'm sure they were happy that it went that way. So that was December 1824, April 1825. Bolivar began a long I'm the president now glory tour of southern Peru and Bolivia, territory just freed from the Spanish, leaving Manuela behind in Lima, or kind of the suburbs of Lima. He didn't see her for 9 months. So again, this is we know a lot of their relationship from letters because they were just apart a lot. And they wrote about how much they loved each other and stuff, kind of Harem Sultan Suleiman vibes a bit. But eventually he was kind of maybe we should break up. But the wording of it suggests maybe this is because her goddamn husband, James Thorne, how many no's does he need in one letter? Clearly more than 12. I guess might have gone to Bolivar to be please break up with her so my wife will come back to this boring life with me, even though she's clearly really well suited to being on La Revolucion. Anyway, so Bolivar might have been okay. Anyway, but he couldn't quit her and she couldn't quit him. And so he returned to Lima, and they rather than break up, they kind of made it official. He started paying for her to have her own house. It was very much with Charles II or Louis XIV with the official mistress role. She had her own home, which side note, I very much respect relationships in which people live separately. I think that's healthy and more people should do it. Anyway, so she lived in her own house, and just everyone, it was no longer a secret. She was his mistress, out of the shadows. So now that she was official mistress and not on the move all the time, so she took on the role similar to the mistresses for Charles II and stuff. She would people come to her with requests, and she could intercede on behalf of refugees or other distressed individuals like Harem Sultan. She really had a soft spot for people who were in trouble or financially especially. She began looking after the needs of Bolivar's men, especially soldiers or junior officers who were ill. She interceded with Bolivar on behalf of individuals seeking pardon or clemency. And I imagine this is part of why she is seen as this heroic figure to Ecuador as well. She wasn't just she was a cool lady wearing pants on a horse in a revolution, being hilarious with a mustache, but she was also doing all this philanthropic stuff. She was being kind and good in this kind of Princess Diana-esque way, but also weird and also sexy. And this is why I want to tell the youth, you don't have to choose. You can be all of those things. But as this was happening and she was thriving, Bolivar not doing so great, vis-a-vis tuberculosis, and also vis-a-vis he was voted in to be the dictator. It sounds like Parliament literally said please be our dictator, and he's yeah. His enemies did not like that he was now the dictator, his enemies being largely the people of Peru. They're in Lima, so kind of surrounded by enemies. So there's lots of plots and conspiracies cooking up all over the place. One of these was some Peruvian anti-Bolivar types noticed that there was this one division of the army who was like maybe discontent, and the anti-Bolivar people were like, we can like, let's just make them be like even more mad, and then maybe they'll like mutiny. So this was the 3rd division of the Colombian army who had been left behind, I guess, in Lima. They were mad about various stuff like not being paid. Understandable. So these guys, like, they did mutiny. They rose against their senior commanding officers, seized control of a palace in Lima, and then some more Peruvian like civilians joined this protest. And Manuela, who was there, was like, oh God, no, what's going on? Because Simone was off doing whatever, but she was still there. So she, first of all, she was like, the archives, like her commitment to these letters and this archive is like really commendable. She's just like, the archive must protect it. So she like smuggled out the archives. And then she's also like, I'm going to settle this myself with my awesome mediation skills. So she put on her pants, literally. She put on her colonel-style man uniform, maybe her mustache. I like to think so. Got her like pistol and her sword. And she went to like personally speak to the members of the battalion to try to convince them to like stop the mutiny. But she knew that like she wasn't going to convince them with just words. So she also like began distributing money among the sergeants and corporals to try and persuade them / bribe them to resist this like rebellion against the rebellion. She had some success with this, but her actions bothered the authorities of Peru because they hated Bolivar and she was like helping Bolivar. So they burst into her home to arrest her. She was like, oh, can you do it in the morning? It's like late and I'm sleepy. And they're like, okay. And then wildly, they just like waited while she slept through the night. And then in the morning, they took her to a women's prison, which I think was just like a part of convent nunnery type situation. And she was kept there for several months, being so annoying. Eventually, they released her. She wrote letters of complaint, and she had enough friends in high places that eventually she won her release. But they were like, okay, we're going to release you, but you have to leave Peru, and you can never come back to Peru. And you have to leave within 24 hours. And so she's like, deal, got it. Farewell, Peru. So she got on a ship to leave. And by this point, just her legend was so strong. She herself was known as the Libertadora. So sort of like Simone was the liberator and she was the Libertadora, the like lady liberator. A public legend to match Bolivar in the minds of some. And that's where we're going to leave it for this week. Next week, we're going to learn more about Manuela. And like now that she and Simone are like in the same city, you know, how does their relationship go? We'll talk about that next time. So, I wanted to mention because in last year I did some like Halloween super special episodes. And I think this is the episode that's airing closest to Halloween. But also because we're looking at South American stories and because Hispanic / Latine / Latinx Heritage Month just ended, I wanted to give some recommendations. So, for instance, if you want to listen to some, there's so many spooky like ghost monster stories coming out of like South America, Central America, Mexico, that there are like a bunch of podcasts about it. One of which is Spooky Tales, which is hosted by Christina, who is the editor of this podcast. And so I super recommend you listen to that. It's like Spooky Tales, like ESPOOKY. Tales, I also super recommend. Monstras podcast, which I mentioned before. They did an episode about Malincine / Malinche and like what kind of like Malinche in myth and legend. Anyway, so it's like Halloween / Day of the Dead are approaching. If you want to listen to some good ghost stories, those are 2 excellent podcasts to scratch that itch. And also, yeah, so if you go to vulgarhistory.com, that's one of the places where you can suggest people who you think that I might want to talk about in future episodes. Like, as I've said, like this season is like, we're inching towards ending International. But there's going to be more seasons, like, and I'm going to always want to share stories from all different countries. So please let me know. Yeah, so vulgarhistory.com is a place where you can send me emails. You can also send me DMs where we are on Instagram at Vulgar History Pod, where I will be putting pictures of Manuela and also of that like outfit with the veil so you can see what I'm talking about. You can also follow / reach out to me on Twitter at Vulgar History. And if you want to support the show, you can go to patreon.com/AnnFosterWriter. That is where. So for $1 a month, you get early access to the podcast, which is also ad-free. You usually get it about 5 days in advance and ad-free. And then if you pledge $5 a month, then you get access to the bonus episodes that I do. So This Asshole. At this point, I feel like Simone Bolivar is someone I want to learn about for that. Although the people on Patreon have been voting, and Genghis Khan, I think, might be the next one of those I'm doing. The most recent one of those So This Asshole I did was Christopher Columbus, who was just like, hui. And then also that's where we do Vulgar Piece Theater, where I'm joined by Lana Wood Johnson, Alison Epstein. We talk about costume dramas. Our most recent one is we talked about Newsies. And then next month, we're going to be talking about Queen Margot, which is finally on streaming. And I recommend everybody watch that movie, even if you're not going to listen to that podcast. You can shop at vulgarhistory.store. Use code TITSOUT for free US shipping, or TITSOUT10 for 10% off. And I hope you have a great week. Keep your mustache and pants on and your tits out, and I'll talk to you all next time. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Ann Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Talmor, Shishin Magachi. Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Brennan Storr.
I'm Paul Bestall.
We're the Ghost Story Guys.
And every 2 weeks, we explore first-person stories of encounters with the paranormal from all around the world.
Then we have some fun reacting to those stories. We like to say our goal is to scare the hell out of you, then make you laugh.
Belief in the paranormal is not required. All you need is a love of great storytelling and curiosity about the world around you.
Subscribe to the Ghost Story Guys now on your favorite podcatcher to hear episodes like High Strangeness in Chicago, The Mystery of Missing Time, and The Haunting of Vietnam, along with dozens of others.
We've talked about mythical bridges, doppelgangers, haunted seaside towns, and so much more.
Remember that story about the guy who was trapped inside a dream and something was hunting him? That was upsetting.
Yes it was.
Want us to help ruin your sleep? Come find the Ghost Story Guys on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else fine podcasts live, or at ghoststoryguys.com.